Deserts are often found in what we call the subtropics, kind of centered on this 30-degree latitude line. And so we can see it in places like North America, in the southwest of the US, in the northern part of Mexico. There are some areas in South America, a couple of separate areas of desert, including the Atacama Desert over here. We have deserts in South Africa, like the Kalahari. The mother of all deserts, of course, is the Sahara, which stretches all across Africa, northern part of Africa, and into the Middle East. And this also continues into other deserts all the way up to the Gobi Desert in central parts of Asia. You'll notice these deserts are somewhat further away from the equator, but that's because they're in the interior of the continent where they're not getting moisture from the oceans. The same is true for places like Nevada. These are what we refer to as the cold deserts. And then, of course, we do have desert in Australia, and that's probably the single largest biome on that continent. As we get further from the equator into what we call the middle latitudes or the temperate zones, we have a number of different kinds of biomes. And so the first one of those is what we call the temperate broadleaf and mixed forests. Broadleaf forests, of course, are trees that have relatively wide leaves, but these are also trees that are basically flowering plants, as opposed to needle leaf trees, otherwise known as conifers. And so these temperate forests that we're going to talk about here can have a mixture of the two. This happens to be one near Washington, D.C., that is made up of broadleaf trees. In this case, these trees are deciduous. They're losing their leaves in the wintertime, and that's because we do have a distinct winter that is too cold for plant growth much plant growth during that time of year. So when we go to, for example, Osaka, Japan, you'll see that we have wetter and drier months of the year, but see how the moisture kind of tracks the temperature, right? We have some months that are a little bit drier, but those are the cold months, so the dryness doesn't matter as much because the trees have lost their leaves. Generally speaking, however, we're going to have moisture available throughout the year. We're going to have a distinct summer season that's going to be more than 20 degrees, typically centigrade, and then a distinct winter season that's going to be quite a bit less than 20 degrees. Okay, so that's what's going to make this biome distinctive. This is Sydney, Australia. Again, you can see rainfall just a bit throughout the year. Certainly enough to not be a dry season per se, but relatively wet throughout the year. In this case, our colder season in Sydney is happening in June and July because, of course, we're in the southern hemisphere with warmer months happening in what is the northern hemisphere summer, or northern hemisphere winter, December and January. Just to look at a forest near Sydney. So this is in Australia. And again, you'll notice these are eucalyptus trees. They're broadleaf trees, but we do have a bit of a winter time. And so this biome really is mostly made up of just trees with occasional shrubs or grasses or other things, compared to the tropical rainforest that has all of these different layers, all of these different growth forms. This one happens to be evergreen. They don't lose their leaves because the winters aren't terribly cold in Australia, but nonetheless, there is somewhat of a winter. This is another shot from Japan, and we can see this is the autumn when the leaves are changing color. So the trees are going to basically break down the photosynthetic machinery of the tree, take all the nutrients from the chlorophyll back into their stems, and that's what's leaving behind these colorful displays. And then they'll go ahead and drop those leaves in the wintertime. And here's another shot from a forest in Russia. This biome, and this is where the map is a little different than what we're going to be thinking of, is especially relating the biomes to climate. First of all, there are some areas that are showing as coniferous forest. We're going to go ahead and lope those in with the temperate broadleaf and mixed forest. So these areas in the southeastern part of the US, they have conifers mostly because of soil issues. So really, it's still part of this same biome. So really, the eastern US, this is the predominant biome in Europe and extending into Russia in some areas. We also have it in East Asia. So much of China, Korea, Japan, these countries, once we're in these regions, we definitely have another formation of this biome. And we do have some in Australia here. So the eastern coast of Australia, that's further away from the equator. We're going to talk about some areas that are showing up this way on this map, but these areas like Tasmania, New Zealand, and then Chile, those really are going to be the temperate rainforest that we're going to talk about next. Again, I would point out this is a relatively diverse biome, but it happens to be in these areas where we have a lot of human activity, a lot of agriculture, large population centers. So the eastern US, Europe, China, Japan, Korea, these are densely populated parts of the world. And so this biome has been greatly altered by human activity. Somewhat separate from this, and I like to keep this separate for a variety of reasons that's not shown in these maps, but this is temperate rainforest. And temperate rainforest is going to be dominated by needle-leaf trees. These are also going to be really large, old and tall trees where there's old growth forest left. So this is in Chile. This is what's called the alerce tree. This is a tree that's 2,600 years old, 57 meters or almost 200 feet high, with a diameter of over 7 feet wide, 2 meters wide. So very, very distinct from other temperate forests. What sets these apart now, and you'll notice the scale here is a little bit different, but the 50 millimeters down here. So this is actually getting some months that are actually quite wet. The other thing is that the temperature here in this biome, these places, because they have this maritime climate where things are really stable. So they don't get too cold in the winter. They also don't get warm in the summer. So they're just kind of this constant cool. Okay, so this is a site in New Zealand. Here's another one in Northern California. Now you'll notice we have that coolness. We don't have any months getting above 20 degrees. You'll notice though that we have a bunch of wet months and then these dry months. But in some of these places, and this is certainly true in California, this dry season is made up by fog. We have fog coming in during that time of year that's bringing a lot of extra moisture. We're getting fog drip from the trees, and that's helping to keep it wet throughout the year, even though it looks like there's kind of a dry season here. And then these other months of the year are quite wet. We're getting more than 100 millimeters in those months. Okay, and of course, here's the redwoods. They're acting like these giant screens. Part of what helps them to grow is the fact that they're so tall and they have these tiny needle leaves. So these are a conifer tree, and they're going to drip that rain down and essentially water themselves from the fog. Here's, of course, the tree everybody wants to drive through. This is a 300-foot tall tree. This is a very tall tree. Most of these temperate rainforest areas have extremely tall trees, and some of the tallest, or not some of the tallest, definitely the tallest trees in the world, in the case of the coast redwoods. Okay, here's what some rainforest in New Zealand looks like. You'll notice another thing that sets this apart and makes it look a little more like tropical rainforest is the fact that we do have some epiphytes. Those epiphytes are going to be oftentimes mosses and ferns, but we can even get shrubs growing up in the trees the same way that we can see in a tropical rainforest. Okay, in this case, it's a temperate rainforest though, and again, it's going to be dominated oftentimes by conifer trees. We're also going to have lots of ferns in these environments. Okay, this is just a nice shot from Oregon, and we can see all of these clouds, again, right at ground level. They're basically going to be cooling things down. So again, we're not going to have any kind of a warm summer. The summer is going to be mild. It's going to be less than 20 degrees. Where do we find this one? Well, it's not really showing up on the map. It's this coniferous forest. But some of these coniferous forests really belong, these are in mountain areas, and that's kind of a separate thing. So it's these brown areas, these light brown areas along the coast of North America. So running from Alaska down to California. We have another small area in Chile. We have another area, if we go across the southern hemisphere, in Tasmania, because these the storms and the weather patterns are coming from the west. So it's these west-facing coasts. So Tasmania, and then New Zealand definitely fits this category. So you'll notice this is now a very restricted biome, and it's also been greatly altered by human activity because of logging. Large portions of the wood that is used for construction and other purposes is harvested in these forests. partly because the trees are very tall, but also because they have these very big trunks. And they do have very high quality wood. So trees like Douglas fir and redwood are coming from these forests. Another temperate biome is temperate grassland. Now we're getting into areas that are definitely on the drier side. They're not so dry as to be deserts, but they have just enough moisture through the year to support the growth of primarily grasses and other small herbaceous plants. This is kind of an iconic scene because just like the savanna, I should mention the savanna is a biome where we have lots of large mammals like elephants and zebra and things like that. So these are sort of the temperate equivalent of that. And so we see animals like bison and antelope and various other deer and hoofed mammals roaming across because grass is really ideal for them. These are going to be places now that definitely have a clear winter and summertime. The summers are going to be warm, the winters are going to be cold, and oftentimes even freezing, depending on where we are. But you'll notice it's just not quite, it's just right at that boundary between what we call a dry season or not. But keep in mind that during the winter time, this is falling as snow. This is a cold winter in this place. This is falling as snow. That snow is going to basically sit on the ground, and then it's going to melt in the springtime. And so the spring months, when the grass is actually growing, means that we're going to have just enough rainfall plus the snow melt to sustain grass, but no more than that. Okay, so these areas might be deserts if it wasn't for that fact. Okay. There's another one, Budapest in Hungary. This is now getting a little bit on the wetter side and kind of transitioning to maybe a temperate broadleaf forest. But again, you can see we're just kind of right on the boundary of the amount of rain not to be a dry season. And again, we have a clear summer months, warmer than 20, and winter months that are quite a bit colder than that. We also have it in the southern hemisphere. So this is in Argentina. These are the Andes Mountains in the background. Again, you can see this really is dominated by just a variety of grasses and maybe a few shrubs or other things here and there. And again, this is mislabeled. This is not Saskatoon in winter. These are some very interesting deer called saiga, or I should say antelope called saiga. And these are on the Asian continent in grasslands there. Where do we find this biome? Well, we find it in the interior of North America, stretching from about Texas up to Canada, through places like Nebraska and Kansas. We find it in Eastern Europe, and then stretching into Asia. We find it in Argentina. These are the Pampas. And then we find a little bit over here in Australia. So really, again, a small number of formations, but some of them are relatively large. I would also point out that this is another biome that has been greatly impacted by human activity because these are really good places for growing crops, particularly grains, wheat and barley, corn. These are all technically grasses, and so it's not surprising that grains as grasses would do well in this biome. The soil is very high quality, and you have a good growing season, just enough for growing grasses and grains, and in some cases other things depending on where you are. So very important for agriculture.